It begins with a silence so thick you can almost hear it pressing against your ears. Imagine stumbling across an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, tucked inside the drawer of a forgotten desk. The headline is barely legible, smeared with time, but the words strike harder than a scream. Father buries his children alive. At first, you think it must be fiction, some grotesque fable whispered around campfires. But no, this was real. This was America. And the more you look, the more you realize the story was not erased by accident. It was buried, like the children themselves. Hi everyone. Welcome to my channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep. Because once you hear what happened that day, you may never be able to forget it. The story begins in a small rural town that outsiders rarely visited. A place of cracked roads, fields of dying corn, and families who carried secrets like second skins. People said the father was quiet, a man who kept to himself, but in whispers behind closed doors, they painted a different picture. He was strict, unyielding, with a streak of violence that surfaced after dark. The kind of man who believed punishment was not discipline unless it broke something inside you. It was the late 1950s, a time when family shame could be concealed by wooden fences and curtains drawn tight. Authorities rarely asked questions in places like this. Men were allowed to rule their households like small kingdoms, and in this kingdom, the children did not laugh. Their eyes told stories their mouths could not. Neighbors claimed they would see them wandering near the edge of the woods, barefoot, their clothes torn, like little ghosts too scared to speak. But no one knew how far the father's madness would go. Not until one cold evening when the ground itself became his accomplice. A pit was dug, a pit no one dared to question. The truth is, the people who lived there did not want to know. Because knowing meant admitting they had stood by. That their silence had killed those children, just as surely as the soil that covered them. The past leaves shadows, and sometimes those shadows still whisper. To understand the horror of what happened, you must first understand the man himself. He wasn't born a monster, at least not in the eyes of his neighbors. He was born into a family that had already been fractured by secrets. His own father was said to be a cruel man, one who ruled with fists and silence. Generational violence is a sickness that seeps deep into the marrow of a bloodline, and by the time he became a father himself, the sickness had taken root. He carried himself with the authority of someone who believed he was chosen to control, to discipline, to decide life and death within his own home. To outsiders, he was just another farmer. Rough hands, dirt under his nails, a face weathered by years in the sun. But to his children, he was something else entirely. A storm, unpredictable, striking without warning. The town pretended not to see it, though the signs were everywhere. Teachers noticed the bruises that were poorly explained. The minister, in his Sunday sermons, tried to offer subtle words of concern, but no one acted, because in that time, in that place, family matters were private. To interfere was to break an unspoken rule, and so, silence protected him. But inside the small creaking house, silence was a weapon. The children walked on tiptoes, their breaths shallow, their laughter choked down before it could escape. Each day was a calculation. Would he be in a mood to tolerate their presence, or would he seek to remind them of their place beneath his boots? He believed in punishment not as correction, but as ritual. Each blow, each cruel word, was part of a system he had built in his mind, an order where his children existed only to bend, to break, and finally, to disappear. And yet, There was something stranger beneath the cruelty. Some said he had become obsessed with religious visions, twisted interpretations of scripture that convinced him his children were not his blood, but demons sent to test him. Others whispered that madness ran in the family, an invisible inheritance passed down like a curse. Whatever the root, his reasoning would soon evolve into something unthinkable. For him, control was no longer enough. He needed finality. He needed silence that would never answer back. And so, one night, his plans took shape in the dirt outside his home. The night it happened was colder than usual. The kind of cold that seeps through cracks in the windows and lingers inside your bones. The children had eaten little, scraps of bread, a thin broth that barely warmed their stomachs. They were quiet that evening, as though they sensed something. Perhaps they had seen the freshly disturbed earth outside. Perhaps they had heard the rhythm of the shovel carving into the ground earlier that day. Whatever they felt, they did not speak of it. They had learned long ago that speaking was dangerous. The father moved about the house with an eerie calmness. Those who would later recall seeing him that day described his face as pale, almost detached, like a man rehearsing something over and over inside his head. He wasn't angry. Anger had been his daily companion for years. No, this was different. This was focus. He had made a decision, and nothing, not pleading, not crying, not the small hands of his children, clasped together in fear, could undo it. When the hour came, he led them outside. The moon was hidden behind clouds, but the lantern he carried cast long, shivering shadows across the yard. The children, thin and exhausted, followed because they had no choice. Some say the oldest knew what was about to happen, that her eyes widened, not with surprise, but with resignation. Others believe none of them could have imagined what was waiting. At the edge of the yard, where the soil had been freshly turned, he stopped. The pit was wide, jagged, dug with the roughness of a man who didn't care about precision, only about depth. Depth enough that once the earth was filled again, no one would stumble upon what lay beneath. He ordered them inside. Small bodies hesitated. He raised his voice. The storm returned, and one by one they climbed down. Neighbors would later claim they heard muffled cries that night. They thought it was the wind, the paritha. They thought it was the sound of animals in the woods. No one went to see. No one asked questions. When the lantern was finally snuffed out, the yard was silent again. Silent, except for the dirt that covered the voices forever. It was not rage that guided his hands as he shoveled the soil back in. It was certainty. In his mind, he wasn't killing his children. He was burying sin itself. By the following morning, the house looked the same as it always had. Smoke rose from the chimney, though no breakfast was being made. The father moved through the rooms as if nothing had changed, his boots leaving faint trails of dirt on the wooden floorboards. He had convinced himself that what he had done was righteous. He believed the silence he had created was holy, ordained. Yet, in that silence, the walls began to echo with something else. Regret, madness, or perhaps the sound of voices he could not silence, no matter how much earth he had thrown over them. The community noticed the children's absence almost immediately. They were used to seeing them shuffling to school, their thin frames carrying books that looked too heavy for their bodies. When days passed and no one appeared, whispers began to stir. The teacher asked where they had gone. The minister, already uneasy with the father's intensity, came by to offer a prayer. But the father had an answer for everything. He said the children had been sent away, that relatives had taken them in, that times were too hard to feed so many mouths, and the town, eager to believe, accepted his lies. But suspicion does not die easily, especially in places where guilt lingers, like smoke in the air. Some neighbors said they saw him wandering at night near the edge of the yard, standing for long stretches of time as if he were listening to something beneath the ground. Others said he had grown thinner, his eyes hollow, his voice carrying strange mutterings as he spoke to no one at all. The truth was trying to break through, but fear kept it buried. The children's absence became a wound no one tended, and in time, the wound scabbed over, concealed by excuses and silence. The father continued his daily routines, plowing the fields, attending church, even nodding politely at those who questioned him. But inside his house, Tita, the air grew heavy. Visitors claimed they felt watched, that the rooms were colder than they should be, that the floors seemed to creak even when no one was moving. It was as though the house itself had absorbed what happened that night, as though the walls remembered what the town wanted to forget. It is often said that buried truths have a way of clawing back to the surface. And for this father, no matter how deeply he tried to press the soil down, something in him could not rest. Witnesses began to notice cracks in his carefully built facade. He muttered to himself in public, words strung together like fragments of scripture and delirium. He warned neighbors that the devil was near, that temptations walked in human form. Some thought he was a prophet unraveling under the weight of visions. Others whispered that he was simply mad. What no one realized at the time was that his madness was not contained within his mind. It leaked into his body. He stopped eating. His eyes sank into his skull, and his hands trembled as though he were carrying an invisible burden too heavy to hold. On certain nights, he was seen pacing the yard where the pit had been filled. His boots dug into the same ground, over and over, as if some part of him wanted to uncover what he had buried, or feared it might uncover itself. Stranger still were the sounds. Families living nearby claimed they heard faint crying late at night, though no children lived on the property anymore. A woman passing by swore she heard scratching beneath the earth, like fingernails against wood. Of course, when the stories spread, people laughed them off. Rural towns survive on superstition, and it was easier to dismiss the sounds as imagination than to confront what they truly suggested. But those who had heard it did not laugh. Their faces grew pale whenever the subject arose, and they quickly changed the conversation. The father's lies could not hold forever. A teacher, unwilling to remain silent, pressed harder, demanding to know where the children had gone. Whispers reached the authorities, though even they seemed reluctant to act at first. Who would dare dig up the earth of a man so firmly convinced he was in the right? Who would risk unearthing what the town had already chosen to bury in silence? But the cracks were widening. His behavior grew erratic, his explanations thinner, and the soil outside his home darker with suspicion. Truth was pressing against the surface, and soon the earth would no longer keep his secret. When the truth finally broke through, it was not through confession, but through suspicion, too heavy to ignore. Authorities arrived one late afternoon, their cars drawing the eyes of every neighbor who had long pretended blindness. The father stood on his porch as they approached, his face pale, his hands stiff at his sides. He did not resist, nor did he welcome them. He simply stared, as though he already knew what they would find. The officers questioned him first, their voices calm but insistent. He repeated the same tired story, that his children had been sent to relatives, that he could no longer afford to care for them, that they were safe and living elsewhere. But when pressed for names, for addresses, for proof, he faltered. His eyes darted to the ground, and for the first time, he seemed small. The search began near the house. The officers moved across the yard, their boots crunching on the earth. Dogs were brought in, sniffing along the fence line, circling back toward the patch of soil where the grass grew thinner, where the ground seemed heavier, wetter. The father's breathing grew uneven as they neared it. His lips moved as if in silent prayer, or perhaps in argument with voices no one else could hear. The digging started slowly, almost respectfully, as if the officers already suspected what lay beneath. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the property, their faces pale, their silence thicker than words. And then, the first unmistakable sign, a scrap of fabric, too small for an adult, rising through the soil. Gasps spread through the crowd. A woman screamed. The father closed his eyes. As the pit gave up its secret, the horror became undeniable. The remains of the children, layered in the earth like a grotesque family portrait, were pulled from the dirt. Small bones, shoes worn thin, pieces of clothing that told stories of lives cut short. Some officers oaked away, unable to keep their composure. Others clenched their jaws, determined to finish the task. The crowd did not speak. No one dared break the silence as the truth emerged, because in that silence was guilt. Every neighbor had known something. Every neighbor had chosen not to see. The father was led away, his face blank, his eyes hollow. Yet in that moment, he looked less like a man and more like an empty vessel, already buried long before his body would ever touch the ground. The trial that followed was not the spectacle one might expect. In fact, it was quiet, eerily quiet, as though the town itself wanted to move past the nightmare without ever truly acknowledging it. The courtroom was filled, but the air was thick with shame. Neighbors who once waved politely to the father now avoided eye contact, their faces drawn and pale, as if the guilt of silence sat on every shoulder. The prosecution painted a picture of cruelty, of obsession, of madness disguised as discipline. They described the father not as a man, but as a destroyer of his own bloodline. Witnesses spoke in hushed tones, admitting they had seen the bruises, heard the screams, noticed the disappearances, but had chosen to believe his lies because it was easier than the truth. Every testimony became another shovel of dirt, not over the children, for their graves had already been filled, but over the illusions the community had built to protect themselves. The father himself remained cold. He did not plead, did not beg for mercy. When asked why, he gave an answer that chilled the room. They were not my children. They were curses. I buried evil before it could grow. His words were not a defense. They were a glimpse into a mind so twisted it had redefined love into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. The jury had little difficulty reaching their verdict. He was sentenced, though no punishment could balance the scale of what had been taken. Yet even as he was led away, whispers haunted the courtroom. How many others had known? How many had chosen silence? Because in crimes like these, guilt is never carried by one man alone. The house where it happened was left to rot. Windows shattered, floorboards buckled, weeds clawed at its frame. Some said it was cursed, that at night you could still hear faint voices beneath the ground, crying out in tones no human throat could match. Others swore they saw the father's shadow pacing the yard long after he was gone, forever bound to the soil he had once trusted to keep his secret. History buries what it cannot face, but like the earth itself, it shifts, it cracks, and eventually, the truth rises.